The woman they whispered about lived in a cabin 2 miles outside Helena, Montana territory, where the pines grew so thick that sunlight barely kissed the forest floor. And on a morning in late April 1876, she was gathering wild mushrooms when she heard the unmistakable sound of a man dying. Clara Winters stopped, her worn leather satchel heavy with foraged herbs, and listened to the ragged breathing coming from somewhere beyond the cluster of Douglas firs to her east. She had lived alone in these mountains for 3 years now, ever since the fever took her parents, and the townspeople started calling her unnatural for the way she could cure ailments that should have killed grown men. The preacher said she consorted with darkness. The shopkeeper refused to sell her sugar unless she paid double. The women clutched their children closer when she walked past, as if her very presence might curse their offspring. But Clara knew something they did not. She knew that yarrow stopped bleeding, that willow bark eased pain, that the right mixture of roots and leaves could pull infection from a wound like drawing poison from a snake bite. Her mother had taught her, and her grandmother had taught her mother, going back generations to a time before men wore black coats and spoke of witchcraft whenever they encountered knowledge they could not understand. The breathing grew more labored, punctuated by a groan that sounded like it came from somewhere deep in a man's chest. Clara moved through the undergrowth with practiced silence, her dark blonde hair tied back with a strip of leather, her calico dress mud-stained at the hem. She was 22 years old and had learned to move through the world like a ghost, taking up as little space as possible, drawing as little attention as she could manage. She found him sprawled against a fallen log, a mountain of a man with shoulders that seemed to span half the width of the tree trunk behind him. His buckskin shirt was soaked through with blood, and even from 10 feet away, Clara could see the angry red stain spreading across his left side. His hair hung past his shoulders in dark waves, matted with sweat and debris, and his face was all hard angles and rough-hewn features, like something carved from the mountain stone itself. His eyes opened as she approached, gray as winter storm clouds, and even in his weakened state, there was something fierce in his gaze that made Clara stop short. "Come to watch me die." His voice was rough, edged with pain but not fear. "Or are you one of them mountain spirits?" "Figure I am about ready to meet whatever comes next." "I am neither spirit nor spectator," Clara said, kneeling beside him and setting her satchel down. "Let me see the wound." He tried to laugh, but it came out as a cough that made him wince. "You got healing hands, little ghost." "I have knowledge, which is often better than hands alone." She did not wait for his permission, pulling aside the blood-soaked buckskin to reveal a deep gash that ran from his lowest rib down toward his hip. It was clean, made by something sharp, probably a knife rather than claws. "What happened?" "Disagreement with some fellows who thought my pelts belonged to them more than they belonged to me." He watched her face as she examined the wound, his breathing shallow but steady. "Name is Samuel Logan, in case you need to know who you are patching up. Clara Winters." She was already pulling supplies from her satchel, her movements efficient and sure. "This will hurt, but if I do not clean it properly, infection will kill you within the week. Do what you need to do. I have had worse." Clara doubted that, but she did not argue. She had learned that men like this, men who lived alone in the wild places and made their living off the land, often measured their worth in how much pain they could endure without complaint. She pulled out a small clay bottle, uncorked it, and met his eyes. "This is whiskey mixed with yarrow and golden seal. It will burn like hellfire." Samuel actually smiled at that, a quick flash of white teeth against his tanned face. "I appreciate the warning." She poured the mixture directly into the wound, and to his credit, Samuel only grunted, his jaw clenching so hard she could see the muscles jump beneath his beard. His hands gripped the log behind him, knuckles going white, but he did not cry out. Clara worked quickly, using clean water from her canteen to flush away the excess blood, then packed the wound with a poultice she had prepared just that morning, a mixture of comfrey, calendula, and wild Oregon grape root bound together with rendered bear fat. "You live near here?" Samuel asked through gritted teeth as she wrapped his torso with strips of clean linen she always carried in her bag. "Near enough." Clara kept her focus on her work, tying off the bandage with firm, even pressure. "You should not move for at least 2 days, and someone needs to change this dressing twice daily. I got a camp about a mile north of here. Been trapping these mountains for near on 5 years now." He tried to sit up straighter and immediately regretted it, his face going pale beneath the tan. "Reckon I can make it if I take it slow. You reckon wrong." Clara sat back on her heels, studying him with the same critical eye she might use to assess a plant she was not certain was safe to consume. "You will tear open what I just closed, and then you will bleed out somewhere between here and there, and the animals will have you for supper." "You got a better suggestion. My cabin is closer, 1.5 miles southwest." The words were out before she could reconsider them, and Clara felt a flutter of something like panic in her chest. She had not invited another soul into her home since her parents died. The cabin was her sanctuary, the one place where she did not have to feel the weight of suspicious stares and whispered accusations. But this man was injured, and she had not spent 3 years learning the healing arts just to let someone die, because she valued her solitude more than a human life. Samuel looked at her for a long moment, those storm-gray eyes searching her face for something she could not name. "You sure about that? I am a stranger, and a rough one at that. Most women would not be too keen on bringing my sort around." Most women did not spend their childhood learning how to set bones and draw poison. Clara stood, brushing dirt from her dress. "Can you walk if I help you? I can do whatever needs doing." But when he tried to rise, he swayed dangerously, and Clara had to brace herself against his considerable weight to keep him upright. He was even larger standing than he had been lying down, easily 6.5 feet of solid muscle and raw strength. Even injured and weakened, there was something almost overwhelming about his physical presence, like standing next to a bear that had decided not to maul you. His arms settled across her shoulders, and Clara could feel the heat of him, fever already starting to set in despite her poultice. They moved slowly through the forest, Samuel leaning on her more than she suspected he wanted to admit, his breathing harsh and labored. Clara guided them along paths only she knew, deer trails and hidden tracks that wound between the pines and over small streams still cold with snowmelt. The sun climbed higher, filtering through the canopy in scattered golden shafts, and birds called out warnings of their passage. "They say you are a witch," Samuel said after a long silence, his voice rough with pain and exertion. Clara stiffened but did not slow her pace. "They say a lot of things. I am not asking what they say, I am asking what you are. I am someone who knows how plants work, how the body works, how to help when help is needed." She adjusted her grip on him as they navigated around a fallen tree. "If that makes me a witch in their eyes, then I suppose I am one. In my eyes, it makes you someone who saved my life." Samuel's weight shifted, and Clara could feel him trying to take more of his own burden despite his obvious weakness. "I got no truck with fools who fear what they do not understand." They did not speak again until the cabin came into view, a small sturdy structure of hand-hewn logs with a stone chimney and a covered porch. Clara had built most of it herself after her father died, her hands learning the weight of an axe and the way to notch logs so they fit together tight enough to keep out the winter cold. Garden beds ran along the south side, already showing the first green shoots of early spring planting, and bundles of dried herbs hung from the porch rafters, turning slowly in the breeze. Inside, the single room was neat and organized with the precision of someone who lived alone and liked it that way. A rope bed stood in one corner, covered with quilts her mother had made. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel crowded with jars and bottles of various sizes, each carefully labeled in Clara's neat script. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the room, and shelves lined every available wall space, filled with more jars, bundles of herbs, leather-bound journals, and the accumulated knowledge of 3 generations of healers. Clara guided Samuel to the bed, and he sank onto it with a groan that he tried to suppress. "I am getting blood on your quilts. Quilts can be washed." She was already moving around the room, gathering supplies, stoking the fire to life, filling a kettle with water from the bucket by the door. "You need to drink this." She handed him a cup filled with a dark tea that smelled of willow bark and valerian root. Samuel drank without question, which told Clara more about his condition than any examination could. A man like this would normally question everything, trust nothing, but pain and blood loss had worn down his natural defenses. She helped him ease back onto the pillows, noting the way his breathing had gone shallow and fast, the fever flush spreading across his cheeks. "Going to be a long night," she said, more to herself than to him. "Seems like you are used to those." Samuel's eyes were already drifting closed, the herbs in the tea starting to take effect. Clara did not answer. She pulled a chair beside the bed and settled in for what she knew would be a difficult watch. Fever was the real enemy now, the body's response to trauma and the ever-present threat of infection. She had seen men twice Samuel's size succumb to wounds half as serious, their bodies simply giving up the fight when the fever burned too hot and too long. But Samuel Logan did not seem like a man who gave up easily. She changed his dressing as the afternoon light slanted through the single window, noting with satisfaction that the bleeding had stopped and the wound edges looked clean. She made him drink more willow bark tea when he woke, and spooned broth into his mouth when he insisted he was not hungry, and bathed his forehead with cool water when the fever spiked as night fell. He talked sometimes, rambling words that did not always make sense, about the mountains and the long winters and the way the world looked from the high peaks where even eagles struggled to fly. He talked about a brother who died young and a father who drank himself to death, and a mother he could barely remember. He talked about choosing the wilderness because it was honest in its cruelty, unlike people who smiled while they slid knives between your ribs. Clara listened and said little, her hands steady as she worked to keep him alive through the long dark hours. She had forgotten what it was like to have another person in her space, the way it changed the air, made the cabin feel simultaneously smaller and more alive. She had forgotten the sound of another voice, even one roughened by fever and pain. When dawn finally broke, pale and gray through the morning mist, Samuel's fever broke with it. His eyes opened clear and focused, and he looked around the cabin with the careful attention of a man assessing his surroundings. "I am still alive, then." "You are." Clara was preparing his morning dose of medicine, grinding dried herbs with a mortar and pestle. "Though it was a near thing around midnight, your fever nearly reached the point where I would not have been able to bring it down. But you did." He tried to sit up and made it further than she expected before the pain stopped him. "How long do I need to stay put?" "At least a week, possibly 2." That wound needs time to close properly, and you need time to regain your strength." She brought him the medicine mixed with water and waited while he drank it. "I know it is not what you want to hear, but that is the reality of healing. It takes time." Samuel studied her over the rim of the cup, and Clara felt suddenly self-conscious under that steady gray gaze. She was not used to being looked at directly, not anymore. The townspeople either stared with suspicion or refused to meet her eyes at all. "Why did you help me? You do not know me." "For all you knew, I could have been one of them outlaws that run these mountains." Clara took the empty cup from him and moved back to the fireplace, needing something to do with her hands. "Because I could help you, so I did. It is not more complicated than that." "It is always more complicated than that." But Samuel let it drop, settling back against the pillows with a wince. "I will pay you. I got pelts cached at my camp and some money besides. Soon as I can walk, I will fetch it for you." "I do not want your money." "Then what do you want?" The question hung in the air between them, and Clara found she did not have an answer. What did she want? To be left alone, mostly. To practice her craft without fear of retribution. To not be called witch every time she walked into town for supplies. But those were not things Samuel could give her, so she said nothing. The days settled into a routine. Clara tended her garden and foraged in the forest while Samuel rested, returning every few hours to check his wound and make sure he drank the medicines she prepared. She changed his dressings with efficient care, noting with satisfaction how cleanly the wound was healing, the edges knitting together without sign of infection. Samuel proved to be a surprisingly easy patient once he accepted that he truly could not move without damaging himself further. He watched her work with quiet interest, asking questions about the plants she used and why she chose certain combinations over others. He was intelligent, she discovered, with a natural curiosity about the world that matched her own. "My mother used to make a tea from willow bark when my brother had headaches," he said one afternoon as Clara ground dried herbs for a new poultice. "Never knew why it worked, just that it did. Willow contains something that eases pain and reduces fever. I do not know exactly what it is or how it works, but I know that it does." Clara measured the powder carefully into a jar. Most medicine is like that. Knowledge passed down because it worked, even if nobody could explain why. Seems like that should be enough. The working part. Samuel shifted on the bed, managing to prop himself up on the pillows without tearing anything. "Do not see why folks need to make it into something evil just because they cannot explain it. Fear makes people cruel." Clara spoke without thinking, then wished she had kept silent. She did not want to talk about the townspeople, about the way they looked at her like something dangerous and unclean. "You are afraid of them." It was not a question. "I am practical about them. There is a difference." She corked the jar with more force than necessary. "They tolerate me because sometimes they need me. When the doctor and Helena cannot help, when someone is desperate enough, they come to me, and I help them because it is what I do. But I am not fool enough to think that tolerance equals acceptance." Samuel was quiet for a long moment. "Seems like a lonely way to live." Clara met his eyes and something in her chest tightened. "It is the way I have." On the fourth day, Samuel managed to walk across the cabin with Clara's support, and on the sixth day he made it to the porch and back without stopping. His strength was returning quickly now that the danger of infection had passed, his body remembering what it was like to be whole and healthy. He insisted on helping around the cabin despite Clara's protests, chopping wood one-handed, fetching water from the spring, doing small repairs that she had been putting off. She scolded him for overexerting himself, but secretly she was glad of the help, and gladder still of the company. It had been so long since anyone had looked at her without fear or suspicion. Samuel looked at her like she was simply a person, someone who had done him a kindness, someone worth knowing. It was a dangerous thing to get used to. "Tell me about your parents," Samuel said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the mountains. He had been with her for just over a week now, and the wound was healing so well that Clara knew he would be able to leave soon if he wanted. She did not want him to want to. "My father was a trapper like you. My mother was the healer. They met when he got hurt in these very mountains, actually. She patched him up, and he decided he did not want to leave." Clara smiled at the memory, bittersweet now. They had 20 good years together before the fever came through. It took half the town, but nobody blamed them for that. They only started blaming me after I saved the rest. Samuel turned to look at her, his expression sharp. "Explain that." The fever was burning through Helena like wildfire. Doctor did not know what to do, and people were dying by the dozen. My parents got sick early, and I could not save them. But I figured out that a tea made from elderflower and yarrow could bring the fever down enough that people could fight it off. I went door to door giving it away, made sure everyone had enough to last until the fever passed. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders against the evening chill. "Saved probably 50 people, and that is when they started calling me witch. Said no natural remedy should work that well. Said I must have made a deal with darkness to gain that kind of power. That is about the most foolish thing I ever heard." The preacher agreed with them, said I was dangerous, said my mother had been teaching me wicked things. Clara's voice went quiet. "I think they wanted someone to blame for the fever for their fear. I was convenient." Samuel's hand found hers on the porch railing, his calloused palm warm against her fingers. "They are fools and worse than fools. You are a healer, Clara. Anyone with half a brain could see that." Her name sounded different in his mouth, softer somehow, and Clara felt something flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. "You should rest. Your body is still recovering." "My body is fine." But he squeezed her hand gently before releasing it and standing. "Thank you for everything." That night, Clara lay in the small cot she had set up for herself near the fireplace, listening to Samuel's steady breathing from the bed, and admitted to herself what she had been trying to ignore for days. She did not want him to leave. She had grown used to his presence, to the sound of his voice and the way he looked at her like she was worth something. She had grown used to not being alone. It was foolish and dangerous, and she knew it would only lead to heartache. Samuel was a mountain man, someone who spent months at a time in the wilderness with no company but his own. Even if he liked her, even if he felt some fraction of what she was beginning to feel, he would not give up his way of life to stay with a woman the whole territory called witch. But knowing that did not stop her heart from hoping. The next morning, Samuel announced that he wanted to return to his camp to check his trap lines and retrieve his cached supplies. "I have been away too long already. Animals will have gotten into my stores if I do not get back soon." Clara nodded, keeping her expression neutral even as disappointment settled heavy in her stomach. "The wound is healed enough that you can travel safely. Just do not overdo it, and if you notice any redness or swelling, you need to treat it immediately. Come with me." She looked up, certain she had misheard. "What? Come with me to my camp. I want to show you something." Samuel was already pulling on his boots, moving with barely a wince now. "Unless you got patients that need tending, no one comes to me unless they are desperate. I could be gone for days, and no one would notice." The words came out more bitter than she intended. "Then come. I owe you more than I can properly repay, but I can at least show you some of the places your father might have trapped. Maybe tell you stories about the mountains that your mother never got to hear." It was the mention of her parents that decided her. Clara found herself nodding, already mentally cataloging what she would need to bring, how long they might be gone. "Give me an hour to prepare." They set out at mid-morning. Samuel leading the way along trails that Clara had never traveled. He moved through the wilderness with absolute confidence, his body remembering the paths, even as his side was still tender from the healing wound. He pointed out landmarks as they walked, telling her about the best places to find game, where the streams ran clearest, which meadows filled with wildflowers come summer. His camp was tucked into a small valley about 3 miles north of her cabin, a simple setup with a canvas lean-to, a stone fire ring, and supplies stored in a wooden cache built high in a tree to keep them safe from bears. Samuel checked his trap lines, finding them empty as he had feared, but the cache was intact and his pelts were still safely stored. "I spend most of the year up here," he said, climbing down from the cache with a bundle of furs over his shoulder. "Only go into Helena maybe twice a year to trade, and even then I do not stay long. People make me nervous in large numbers." Clara laughed at that, surprising herself. "I understand the feeling." Samuel spread the pelts out for her to see, explaining how to tell quality furs from poor ones, how to treat them properly so they stayed supple and undamaged. He showed her his traps and how they worked, demonstrated how to read animal signs in the dirt and snow, taught her a dozen small skills that mountain men learned through hard experience. They talked as they worked, long, rambling conversations about everything and nothing. Samuel told her about growing up in Ohio, how he had headed west as soon as he was old enough to leave, drawn by stories of wild lands and freedom. Clara told him about learning healing from her mother, about the old journals filled with recipes and remedies passed down through generations. "You ever think about writing your own journal?" Samuel asked as they sat by his fire that evening, eating roasted rabbit and wild onions. "Adding to what your mother and grandmother started, I have been, since they died." Clara poked at the fire with a stick, watching sparks spiral up into the darkening sky. "It feels important somehow, like keeping them alive by keeping their knowledge alive. You should keep doing it. World needs people like you, people who know how to heal." He paused, then added quietly, "I need people like you." Clara looked at him across the fire, and in the flickering light she could see something in his expression that made her breath catch. "Samuel, I know I got no right to say this. I know you got your life and your cabin and your work. But these past weeks staying with you, it has been the most at peace I felt in years." He stood, moving around the fire to crouch beside her. "I do not want to go back to being alone, Clara. I do not want to leave you alone either." "What are you saying?" Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "I am saying that I want to stay. Not in your cabin, I would not presume that much, but nearby. Close enough that you are not alone anymore, close enough that I can help you with the heavy work and you can tell me about your plants and we can just be together." His hand came up to cup her cheek, rough and warm. "I am saying that somewhere between you pouring that hellfire into my wound and now I fell in love with you." Clara's heart was pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. "They call me witch. I call you healer. I call you brave and kind and the most remarkable woman I ever met." His thumb brushed across her cheekbone. "I do not care what they call you, Clara. I only care what you want." What did she want? She wanted this, she realized. This man with his storm-gray eyes and gentle hands, who looked at her like she hung the moon, who called her healer instead of witch. She wanted to not be alone anymore, wanted to have someone to talk to in the evenings and wake up beside in the mornings. She wanted to be loved, and to love in return. "I want you to stay," she whispered, and then his lips were on hers, gentle at first and then deeper, and Clara felt like she was falling and flying at the same time. They stayed at his camp that night, wrapped together in his bedroll under the stars, talking in quiet voices about the future they might build together. Samuel would move his operation closer to her cabin, he said. build his own place nearby so folks could not gossip about impropriety, but close enough that they could see each other every day. He would help her with the hard physical work of maintaining the cabin and gardens, and in return, she could teach him more about healing herbs. They would be partners in all things. "We should get married," Samuel said suddenly, his arms tightening around her. "Make it proper and official so nobody can say otherwise." Clara's breath caught. "You want to marry me, even with what people say, especially with what people say." "I want everyone to know that you are mine and I am yours, that we chose each other." He kissed her forehead. "Unless you do not want that, I want that." Clara turned in his arms so she could see his face. "I want that more than anything." They returned to her cabin the next day, and Samuel, true to his word, immediately began planning where he would build his own cabin. He selected a spot about 100 yards from Clara's, close enough for convenience, but far enough to maintain propriety. He spent the next weeks falling trees and shaping logs. His strength fully returned now, his wound nothing but a thin scar on his side. Clara helped when she could, but mostly she continued her own work, tending her gardens and her patients when they came, though they came less frequently now that word had spread that she had taken up with a mountain man. She tried not to let it bother her. She had Samuel now, and that was worth more than the approval of people who had never trusted her anyway. They married in late June on a warm evening with the mountains turning purple in the fading light. The preacher in Helena refused to perform the ceremony, as Clara had expected, but there was a traveling minister passing through who had no knowledge of the local gossip and was happy to earn a few coins for his services. They stood in Clara's garden with wildflowers blooming all around them, and Samuel took her hands in his and promised to love and protect her for all the days of his life. Clara promised the same, her voice steady and sure, and when Samuel kissed her as his wife, she felt something settle into place in her chest, something she had not even realized was broken. They spent their wedding night in her cabin, which Samuel had insisted on repairing and improving over the past weeks. He had fixed the roof and reinforced the walls and built her new shelves for her ever-growing collection of remedies. He had made the space more theirs rather than just hers, and Clara found she loved having evidence of his presence everywhere she looked. "I never thought I would have this," she admitted as they lay tangled together in the big bed, her head on his chest, his fingers trailing through her hair. "A husband, a partner. I thought I would spend my whole life alone." "You are never going to be alone again," Samuel promised. "I am not going anywhere, Clara. This is where I belong now, with you." The summer passed in a golden haze of happiness. Samuel finished his cabin but spent most of his nights in Clara's anyway, unable to stand being separated from her even by 100 yards. They worked side by side during the days, Samuel checking his trap lines and hunting game while Clara tended her gardens and prepared medicines. They explored the mountains together, Samuel showing her secret places he had discovered over years of wandering, Clara teaching him how to identify useful plants and when to harvest them. In late August, a young woman from Helena appeared at the cabin, heavily pregnant and frightened. Her labor had started early. She gasped out, and the doctor was away treating an outbreak of cholera in a mining camp to the south. She had nowhere else to go. Clara brought her inside and settled her on the bed while Samuel discreetly retreated to his own cabin. The birth was long and difficult, the baby positioned wrong, and Clara worked through the night using every bit of knowledge she possessed to turn the child and guide it safely into the world. By dawn, she had delivered a healthy baby girl, and the mother was exhausted but alive. "Thank you," the woman sobbed, clutching her daughter to her chest. "Thank you. I know what people say about you, but I did not know where else to turn." "What people say does not matter," Clara said gently, cleaning her hands in a basin of water. "What matters is that you and your daughter are healthy. Rest now, and I will prepare something to help with your recovery." The woman stayed 3 days, regaining her strength under Clara's care. When her husband came to collect her, he looked at Clara with something like awe and pressed money into her hands despite her protests. "You saved them both. The whole town needs to know what you did." But the whole town did not want to know. If anything, the gossip grew worse after that. Some said Clara had used dark magic to turn the baby when it should have died. Others whispered that she must have caused the difficult labor in the first place, just so she could swoop in and play hero. The preacher gave a sermon about false prophets and the dangers of seeking help from unholy sources. Clara tried not to let it hurt her, but it did. She had saved a woman's life, delivered a healthy child, and still they called her witch. Still they feared her. Samuel found her crying in the garden one evening, and he pulled her into his arms and held her while she shook. "They will never accept me," she said against his chest. "No matter what I do, no matter how many people I help, they will always think I am something evil. Then to hell with them." Samuel's voice was fierce. "You do not need their acceptance, Clara. You got me, and I know what you are. You are good and skilled, and you save lives. That is the truth, and it does not matter one bit if they are too stupid to see it. But it does matter. It matters because I live here, because I have to face them when I need supplies, because I cannot spend my whole life hiding in these mountains." "Why not?" Samuel pulled back to look at her face. "We got everything we need right here. I can hunt and trap, you can grow and gather. We do not need Helena. We do not need any of them." Clara wanted to believe him, wanted to think that their love was enough to sustain them, but she was practical enough to know that winter was coming and they would need supplies they could not make or grow themselves. She would need flour and salt and other staples, and there was only one place to get them. They made the trip into Helena together in early September, Samuel insisting on accompanying her despite her protests that she had been making the journey alone for years. "You were alone then." "You are not anymore," was all he said, and Clara found she did not have the heart to argue. The town was busy, people preparing for winter, stocking up on supplies before the mountain passes became impassable. Clara kept her head down as they walked to the general store, aware of the way conversations stopped as she passed, the way people drew back as if afraid she might contaminate them with a touch. Inside the store, the shopkeeper's expression soured when he saw her. "I do not want trouble." "Then do not start any," Samuel said, his voice flat and dangerous. "My wife needs supplies, and you are going to sell them to her at fair price. No haggling, no doubling costs because you think you can." The shopkeeper looked at Samuel, really looked at him, taking in the height and the muscle and the way he stood like a man who knew how to handle trouble when it came. "Your wife, my wife," Samuel confirmed, moving to stand beside Clara, his hand resting possessively on her lower back. "Clara Logan now, and anyone who has a problem with her has a problem with me." The message was clear, and the shopkeeper swallowed hard before nodding. "No problem here. What do you need?" They got their supplies without further incident, though Clara was aware of eyes on them the whole time, people whispering behind their hands. Samuel seemed unbothered, chatting easily with the shopkeeper about weather and game populations as if they were old friends rather than strangers conducting an uneasy transaction. On their way out of town, they passed the church just as the preacher was emerging from the building. He saw Clara and stopped, his expression hardening. "Mrs. Winters, still practicing your dark arts, I see." "It is Mrs. Logan now," Samuel said before Clara could respond. "And she practices healing, which seems more in line with what your Bible preaches than what you do, if I am being honest." The preacher's face went red. "You do not know what you are talking about, stranger. That woman is dangerous. She traffics with forces beyond human understanding." "She traffics with plants and knowledge and hard work," Samuel shot back. "Same as any doctor, except she is better at it. You call it dark arts because you are afraid of what you do not understand, but that is your failing, not hers. You would defend a witch." The preacher's voice rose, drawing attention from passers-by. "I would defend my wife," Samuel said, his voice dropping to something low and dangerous. "And I would be real careful about what accusations you throw around, preacher man. Slander is still slander, even when it comes from a pulpit." They left before the confrontation could escalate further, but Clara felt shaken by the encounter. "You should not have done that. You should not have made an enemy of him for my sake. He was already your enemy. I just made sure he knew you were not facing him alone anymore." Samuel helped her onto their horse, then swung up behind her. "I meant what I said, Clara. Anyone who has a problem with you has a problem with me, and I am a whole lot harder to intimidate than you are." Clara leaned back against his chest as they rode, letting his solid presence reassure her. She had spent so long fighting her battles alone that she had forgotten what it felt like to have someone on her side. Someone willing to stand up for her, even when it made his own life harder. Autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, and Clara found herself happier than she had been in years. She and Samuel fell into an easy rhythm, their lives intertwining in ways that felt both natural and miraculous. He helped her preserve the last of her garden harvest, and she taught him how to make salves and tinctures that he could use when he was out on the trap lines. They talked for hours every evening, sharing stories and dreams and the comfortable silence of two people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. In October, Clara realized she was pregnant. She knew the signs, had helped enough women through their own pregnancies to recognize what was happening in her own body. The morning sickness, the fatigue, the subtle changes that most people would not notice, but that she, with her healer's awareness, recognized immediately. She told Samuel one evening as they sat by the fire, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and fear. "I am with child." He went very still, his eyes searching her face. "You are certain?" "As certain as I can be without waiting a few more months to be sure." She took his hand and placed it on her stomach, which was still flat but would not be for long. "We are going to have a baby, Samuel." The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise, brilliant and warming. He pulled her into his arms, holding her so gently it made her throat tight. "A baby. We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Clara asked, needing to hear him say it. Happy does not even begin to cover it. Samuel pulled back just enough to kiss her, soft and sweet. "I love you, Clara, you and our child. I am going to take care of both of you, I promise." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter months. Samuel became almost comically protective, insisting on doing all the heavy work, fretting when Clara so much as lifted a bucket of water. She found it both endearing and occasionally frustrating, but she understood his concern. They were isolated out here, miles from any doctor, and while Clara trusted her own skills, she knew that childbirth was dangerous even under the best circumstances. They made it through the winter without serious incident. Samuel's traps provided meat and pelts they could trade when the passes cleared, and Clara's carefully preserved stores kept them well fed even during the coldest months. They spent long evenings by the fire, Samuel reading aloud from the few books they owned while Clara worked on baby clothes, stitching tiny garments from soft fabric she had been saving for just such a purpose. In February, a terrible blizzard swept through the mountains, burying their cabins in snow and trapping them inside for nearly a week. Clara was 5 months along by then, her belly finally starting to show the evidence of the life growing within. She stood at the window watching the snow fall in thick sheets, feeling isolated in a way that made her chest tight. "What if something goes wrong?" she asked Samuel, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at her for weeks. "What if the baby comes and there are complications? I can help other people, but I cannot help myself." Samuel came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her and resting his chin on top of her head. "Then we will deal with it together. You are the smartest, most capable person I know, Clara. You are going to teach me everything you know about childbirth, and when the time comes, I am going to help you bring our baby into the world, and it is going to be fine." "You cannot know that." "No," he admitted. "But I can choose to believe it, and I can do everything in my power to make it true. And so can you." Clara leaned back against him, drawing strength from his certainty. Samuel was right. She had spent years learning the art of healing, had assisted at dozens of births. She knew what to expect, knew what could go wrong and how to handle it. She just had to trust in her own knowledge and in the man who loved her. Over the following weeks, she taught Samuel everything she could about childbirth. She showed him the herbs she would need, explained the stages of labor, described what normal looked like, and what signs would indicate danger. Samuel learned with the same focused intensity he brought to everything, asking questions until he understood completely, making her repeat instructions until he had them memorized. "You are going to be amazing at this," Clara said one evening after a particularly thorough teaching session. "I am terrified," Samuel admitted, "but I will do what needs doing. I always have." Spring came slowly to the mountains, snow giving way to mud and then finally to the first brave shoots of green. Clara was 7 months along by then, her belly large and round, the baby moving constantly beneath her ribs. She felt ungainly and huge, but Samuel looked at her like she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "You are carrying our child," he said when she complained about her size. "You are growing a whole person inside you. That is not ungainly, Clara. That is miraculous." In late May, Clara woke in the middle of the night to the first pains of labor. She lay still for a moment, breathing through the contraction, assessing the intensity and duration. Early labor, she determined. She had time. "Samuel," she shook his shoulder gently. "It is time." He was awake instantly, sitting up and reaching for her. "Are you sure? Should I do something? What do you need?" Despite the situation, Clara had to smile at his obvious panic. "I need you to stay calm. This is going to take a while and I need you focused, not frantic." Samuel took a deep breath, and she watched him visibly gather himself, the panic fading from his eyes as his natural competence took over. "Tell me what to do." The labor progressed through the day, long and exhausting but not abnormally so. Samuel stayed by her side every moment, supporting her through contractions, helping her walk when movement eased the pain, holding cool cloths to her forehead when the work became intense. He was calm and steady and exactly what she needed, his presence grounding her when the pain threatened to overwhelm her focus. By evening, Clara was fully in active labor, the contractions coming hard and fast. Samuel had prepared everything exactly as she had taught him: hot water and clean linens, and all the supplies they might need. He helped her into the position she found most comfortable and knelt behind her, supporting her weight, murmuring encouragement as she worked to bring their child into the world. "You are doing so well," he said, his voice steady even though she could feel his hands trembling slightly against her shoulders. "You are the strongest person I know, Clara. You can do this." And she could. She did. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the cabin in shades of rose and gold, Clara delivered their son into Samuel's waiting hands. The baby's first cry was loud and indignant, and Clara felt tears streaming down her face as Samuel carefully placed the child on her chest. "A boy," Samuel said, his voice choked with emotion. "We have a son, Clara." She looked down at the tiny red face, the perfect miniature fingers already grasping at air, and felt her heart expand in a way she had not known was possible. "He is perfect." "He is," Samuel agreed, pressing a kiss to her sweat-soaked temple. "And so are you. You were amazing." The baby, whom they named Simon after Samuel's late brother, proved to be healthy and strong. He nursed well, slept in reasonable stretches, and had lungs that could probably be heard in Helena when he decided to use them. Clara recovered quickly from the birth, her knowledge of healing herbs ensuring that she avoided the complications that claimed so many new mothers. Samuel was completely besotted with his son. He held Simon for hours, talking to him in a low, rumbling voice, showing him the cabin and the mountains beyond the windows as if the infant could understand. He changed dirty cloths without complaint, walked the floor during fussy nights, and looked at Clara with such deep love that it made her breath catch every single time. "I never knew I could feel like this," he said one night, cradling Simon against his broad chest while the baby slept. "Like everything before was just waiting for this, for you and him." "I know what you mean," Clara said softly. "I spent so long alone thinking that was all I could have, and now I have everything." They settled into the rhythms of parenthood, exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Clara was grateful beyond words that she had Samuel to share it with, to take turns with night feedings and fussy evenings, to laugh with over Simon's various baby antics, and to worry with when he seemed unwell. When Simon was 3 months old, they made their first trip into Helena as a family. Clara was nervous about how people would react, but Samuel was adamant that they needed supplies and that hiding away would only give credence to the ugly rumors. The reactions were mixed. Some people ignored them entirely, pretending Clara and her family simply did not exist. Others stared openly, whispering behind their hands, but a few, including the young mother Clara had helped deliver the previous year, greeted her warmly. "Your boy is beautiful," the woman said, peeking at Simon nestled in Clara's arms. "You deserve this happiness after everything you did for me and my daughter." It was a small kindness, but it meant more than Clara could express. The shopkeeper was cordial this time, processing their order without comment or overcharging. The preacher saw them from across the street and pointedly turned away, but Samuel just laughed. His loss. He is missing out on knowing the best woman in the territory. As Simon grew from infant to baby, Clara found herself occasionally seeing other patients again. Word had spread in quiet circles that the healer in the mountains had successfully delivered her own child, and women in difficult pregnancies began making the trek to her cabin, seeking advice and treatment. Clara helped them all, never turning anyone away, and slowly, carefully, her reputation began to shift. She was still called witch by some, would probably always carry that label among certain circles. But others, especially women, began calling her by a different name, the healer in the mountains. The woman who saved lives. The herbalist who knew more than the Helena doctor about women's ailments and children's fevers. Samuel continued his trapping, but he restructured his routes so he was never gone for more than a day or two at a time. He could not stand to be separated from Clara and Simon for longer than that, he said. His family was more important than any number of pelts. When Simon was a year old, Clara found herself pregnant again. This time the news brought pure joy with no fear attached. She knew what to expect now, knew she could do this with Samuel by her side. Their daughter was born in early spring, an easier birth than Simon's had been. She came into the world with a shock of dark hair and her father's gray eyes, and they named her Catherine after Clara's mother. "Two," Samuel said, holding Catherine while Simon toddled around the cabin, getting into everything. "We have two perfect children." "We do," Clara agreed, watching her husband with their daughter and feeling so full of love she thought she might burst with it. "We have everything." The years passed in a sweet blur of family life and work and deep contentment. Simon grew tall and curious, following Samuel on his trap lines as soon as he was old enough, learning the ways of the wilderness from his father. Catherine was quieter but no less determined, spending hours in the garden with Clara, learning to identify plants and their uses. When Simon was 5 and Catherine was 3, Clara discovered she was pregnant a third time. Twins, she realized partway through the pregnancy, based on the size and the way she could feel two distinct sets of movements. Samuel was both thrilled and terrified. "Twins, that is twice the risk." "It is also twice the blessing," Clara countered. "And I know what I am doing. We will be fine." She was right. The twin boys were born healthy and strong on a warm summer evening, both of them squalling their displeasure at being evicted from their comfortable home. Samuel held one while Clara held the other, and they looked at each other across the dimly lit cabin and laughed in sheer amazement at their growing family. They named the twins Jacob and James, and if their household was chaos for the next several years, it was joyful chaos. Samuel built additions onto the cabin to accommodate their expanding family, and Clara taught all of her children about herbs and healing from the time they could walk. The townspeople of Helena grew slowly more accepting over the years. As Clara's children grew, and people saw that they were normal, healthy kids being raised by loving parents, the witch accusations faded to occasional mutters from the oldest generation. Younger women sought Clara out regularly for help with their own pregnancies and children's ailments, and eventually, the Helena doctor himself referred patients to her when he encountered conditions outside his expertise. "You have won them over," Samuel said one evening as they sat on the porch watching their 4 children play in the yard. Simon was 12 now, already showing signs of the man he would become, tall and strong like his father. Catherine was 10 and could identify every plant in a 100-yard radius. The twins were 7, impossible to tell apart and absolutely inseparable. "I did not win them over," Clara corrected. "I just outlasted their prejudice, and you helped. Having you stand beside me all these years made them take me seriously in a way they never would have if I was still alone. That is their failure, not yours. You were always worthy of respect." Samuel took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "But I am glad I could help. Glad I could be here for all of this." Clara squeezed his hand, looking at the life they had built together. The children playing in the golden evening light, the garden overflowing with medicinal herbs and vegetables. The cabins they had expanded and improved over the years until they were practically a single sprawling home. The community they had slowly, carefully built with each other, and then with their children. "I still remember the day I found you dying against that log," she said softly. "I had no idea that helping you would change everything." "I knew," Samuel said. "The moment I saw you walking toward me through those trees, I knew you were going to change my life. I just did not know how completely." He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "Best thing that ever happened to me was getting stabbed," Clara laughed despite herself. "That is a terrible thing to say, but true." He grinned at her, that same flash of white teeth that had charmed her more than 15 years ago. "Meant it then, mean it now." "You saved my life that day, Clara, in more ways than one." As the sun set behind the mountains and their children's laughter rang through the valley, Clara thought about all the names she had been called over the years. Witch, healer, herbalist, wife, mother. Some of those names had been meant to hurt, and some had been gifts, but all of them had been true in their own way. But the name that mattered most was the one Samuel whispered as he pulled her close that evening, the children finally in bed, the cabin quiet and peaceful. Beloved. She was the herbalist they called witch. She was the healer who saved lives with plants and knowledge. She was the woman who had been alone and afraid and had chosen to help a dying man anyway, not knowing that kindness would lead to love. And she was beloved by a mountain man who had married her anyway, who had stood by her side through prejudice and fear, who had given her a family and a life beyond anything she had ever dreamed possible. The mountains remained wild and beautiful around them, and the townspeople would probably always whisper stories about the healer who lived in the forest. But Clara no longer walked alone through those trees. She had Samuel's hand to hold, children's voices calling her home, and a future that stretched bright and promising before them all. Years continued to pass with the steady rhythm of mountain life. Simon at 16 was trapping alongside Samuel, learning the business his father had built. Catherine at 14 was developing skills that surpassed even Clara's in identifying rare plants and their medicinal properties. The twins at 11 were a constant source of energy and mischief, keeping both parents on their toes. Clara was 40 now, her hair showing strands of silver, but Samuel still looked at her the way he had that first evening on her porch, like she was something precious and miraculous. He was 45, his dark hair heavily streaked with gray, but his body was still strong and capable, shaped by decades of mountain life. "I want to write down everything," Clara said one evening as they sat together after the children had gone to bed. "Not just the remedies and recipes, but the stories too, how we met, how the town treated us, how we built this life despite everything. I want our children and their children to know where they came from." "Then write it down," Samuel said simply. "You have always been good with words. Your journals are clearer than any doctor's notes I ever saw." So Clara began writing their story in the evenings, filling page after page with memories and emotions, and the small details that made their life together real. She wrote about finding Samuel bleeding in the forest, about those first careful days of healing, and the moment she realized she loved him. She wrote about their wedding and Simon's birth, and the slow acceptance of the town. She wrote about the hard times and the joyful times and the quiet everyday moments that had made up their years together. One autumn day when Clara was 43, a fancy carriage rolled up to their cabin, an unusual sight so far from town. A well-dressed man emerged, introducing himself as a doctor from San Francisco who had heard about the healer in the Montana mountains, whose methods were achieving remarkable results. "I am writing a book about frontier medicine," he explained. "I would very much like to document your knowledge, if you would permit it, not to steal your methods, but to preserve them for future generations of doctors." Clara looked at Samuel, who nodded encouragingly. "Let the whole world know what you can do, love." So the doctor spent a week at their cabin, carefully documenting Clara's remedies and methods, watching her work, asking endless questions about why she chose certain plants for certain ailments. He treated her with respect bordering on reverence, calling her treatments innovative and her understanding of healing advanced far beyond most university-trained physicians. "You should be teaching," he said before he left. "Your knowledge is too valuable to be hidden away in these mountains." But Clara shook her head. "My knowledge is not hidden. Everyone who needs help knows where to find me, and I have taught my children everything I know. That is enough." After he left, Samuel pulled her close. "You could have more, you know, recognition, respect from people who matter." "I have everything that matters right here." Clara looked around at their home, heard her children's voices from the yard. You, them, this life we built. I do not need anything else. Time moved on as it always did. Simon married a kind woman from Helena when he was 20, someone who did not flinch from the family's reputation, but instead asked Clara to teach her about healing herbs. Catherine at 18 announced she wanted to travel, to learn from other healers in other places, and though it broke Clara's heart a little to let her go, she understood. The twins at 15 were growing into their own persons, no longer identical in personality, though they still looked exactly alike. When Clara was 50, the doctor from San Francisco published his book, with an entire chapter devoted to her methods. Letters began arriving from other doctors, asking questions, seeking advice. Clara answered them all, sharing what she knew freely, and slowly her influence spread far beyond the Montana mountains where she lived. "You are famous now," Samuel teased, reading a particularly effusive letter from a doctor in Boston. "I am a grandmother now," Clara corrected. Simon and his wife had just had their first child, a little girl. "That is far more interesting than being famous." But Samuel took her hand, his expression serious. "You saved so many people, Clara, not just with your herbs, but by refusing to let them make you small, by insisting on being who you are even when they called you witch. You changed minds by just being yourself and doing what you knew was right." "We changed minds," Clara corrected. "You stood beside me. You gave me the courage to keep going when I wanted to give up. This was never just me, Samuel. It was always us." He pulled her close, and they stood together on the porch as they had countless times over the past 30 years, watching the sun set behind the mountains they both loved. "Always us," he agreed. The years were kind to them. Samuel remained strong and healthy well into his 60s, still running trap lines though Simon had taken over most of the business. Clara's hands grew gnarled with age but never lost their skill, still able to precisely measure herbs and prepare remedies. They watched their children grow and marry and have children of their own. They watched the town of Helena grow from a rough frontier settlement into a proper city. They watched the world change around them while their love remained constant. When Clara was 65 and Samuel was 70, they took a rare trip to visit Catherine, who had settled in Seattle and opened a clinic where she treated patients using the methods her mother had taught her. Seeing her daughter respected and sought after, using the knowledge Clara had feared would die with her, filled Clara with a satisfaction she could not put into words. "You did that," Samuel said, watching Catherine work. "You took what your mother taught you and passed it on, and now it is going to keep spreading. Your mother would be proud." "I hope so," Clara said softly. "I hope she knows that it mattered, that all those years of being called witch and feared and isolated, that it still mattered because the knowledge survived." They returned to their mountain home, to the cabin that had been expanded and improved until it was quite comfortable, with separate bedrooms for when their children and grandchildren visited. The garden was as productive as ever, tended now by Clara with help from Simon's wife, who had proven to have quite the gift for growing medicinal herbs. One evening in late summer, as they sat on their porch watching yet another sunset, Samuel turned to Clara with a soft smile. "If I could go back and do it all again, I would not change a single thing. Getting stabbed, finding you, all of it. Every moment led me here to this life with you, and I am grateful for all of it." Clara leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart. "I would not change anything either, except maybe I would have told you I loved you sooner. I knew anyway." Samuel kissed the top of her head. "Pretty sure I loved you from the moment you poured that hellfire into my wound and did not even blink when I cursed." She laughed, the sound carrying across the valley they had called home for more than 40 years. "You did curse quite impressively." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky turned from gold to pink to deep purple, the first stars beginning to emerge. 4 decades of marriage, of partnership, of love that had survived prejudice and isolation, and all the small challenges that life threw at them. 4 decades of being not alone, of having someone who stood beside her no matter what, who called her healer when the world called her witch. Their grandchildren played in the yard, 5 of them ranging from ages 3 to 10, their laughter bright in the cooling evening air. Simon was teaching the oldest boy to whittle, passing down skills that Samuel had taught him. The future stretched out before them, full of life and promise and the continuation of everything Clara and Samuel had built together. "We did good," Clara said softly. "We did better than good." Samuel's arm tightened around her shoulders. "We built something real, something that is going to last long after we are gone. That is more than most people can say." As night fell over the Montana mountains, Clara thought about the frightened, lonely woman she had been at 22, living in isolation because the town feared what she could do. She thought about the bleeding man she had found in the forest, and the choice she had made to help him despite having every reason to protect herself first. She thought about all the moments between then and now, the accumulation of days and months and years that had transformed 2 solitary souls into a family, into a legacy. The townspeople had called her witch, but Samuel had called her healer. He had seen past the fear and the rumors to the truth of who she was. He had loved her not despite her gifts, but because of them, because she used her knowledge to help others, because she refused to be made small by other people's prejudice. And in loving her, he had saved her just as surely as she had saved him that day in the forest. He had given her partnership when she thought she would spend her whole life alone. He had given her children and grandchildren, a family that would carry on the healing knowledge she had feared would die with her. He had given her a life full of purpose and meaning and the kind of deep, abiding love that most people only dreamed about. She was the herbalist they called witch. But she was also beloved, and mother and grandmother, and the woman who had changed frontier medicine in ways that would ripple forward through generations. She was all of those things and more, and the mountain man who had called her healer and married her anyway had made it all possible. Their story was one of finding each other against all odds, of building something beautiful in a harsh landscape, of love that endured through everything life threw at them. And as they sat together watching the stars emerge over their mountain home, surrounded by family and the fruits of a lifetime of work and devotion, Clara knew that this was what happily ever after actually looked like. Not perfect, not always easy, but real and true, and filled with the kind of love that lasted the end.